Hello, everyone, and we welcome you to this lesson that we're teaching today. We're going to be teaching about influencing like Jesus. And for those of you who don't know who I am, my name is Pastor Jason Fulmer, and I pastor a church here in the Camp Humphrey, South Korea area, where we not only have an outreach to our U.S. military members and the local communities here, but we also have a development ministry that we extend to our military here as well. And I get the incredible privilege of teaching this lesson to some of the leaders of our U.S. military, and I'll be teaching it tomorrow, but that class is going to be interactive with Q&A and that type of stuff. And so I'm just doing this as kind of like a podcast style for you here on our blogs. So this is going to be posted to both of my blogs, pastorfulmer.com as well as NextLevelLiving.blog, pastorfulmer.com and NextLevelLiving.blog. We hope that you will subscribe to one or both of those and have your life enriched through the lessons that we teach. So before we get started, we do use the Bible for our reference and for our source here from which we teach, because we believe that the most influential leader of all time was Jesus Christ of Nazareth. But that doesn't mean that someone has to be a Christian in order to apply the principles that we teach. These principles apply across all areas of life. And so we just want to share with you that if you're a Christian or not, the principles still apply. If you have a friend or a family member who is, maybe they're not a Christian, maybe they're in a different religion, maybe they're atheistic, whatever, the principle still applies. So if they're interested in development, if they're in a leadership position, and they're just looking for ways to develop themselves and get better, hey, share the content. Maybe on it through an email, tell somebody about pastorfulmer.com or tell someone about NextLevelLiving.blog, and hopefully together we will be able to grow and help someone move to their next level of living. And so for today's lesson, we'll be teaching about influencing like Jesus. Let's first talk a little bit about influence. So what is influence? It's the capacity to have an effect on someone. And that's pretty much it. It's the capacity to have an effect on someone else. You can influence yourself just like you can influence anybody else. As a matter of fact, another thing the Bible teaches us is that if we would influence or judge ourselves first, then we wouldn't. If we would influence ourselves first, we wouldn't need judging. And so another way of saying that, if you can influence yourself first, then someone else doesn't have to come along and do it for you. So among influencing others, you can also influence yourself just like you can anyone else. Now, this influence can be in either a positive manner or a negative manner. And we're going to teach some things here today in this lesson from the book of John, that these things, they could be used to manipulate people, but we are definitely not teaching to do it that way. We're teaching to use positive influence in people's lives. Now, influence pours over into the topic of leadership. If you can influence someone, then you can lead them. So influence in leadership, you're able to lead someone if you can influence them. This rule of influence applies whether the person is at a lower, equal, or higher level of authority than you. If you can influence someone, you can lead them. So that means you can lead someone that's above you at your current level or even below your current level of authority. If you can influence someone, you can lead them. And sometimes you can lead someone without them even knowing or being aware that it's taking place. If you're in leadership right now, or you're in some kind of position where you're developing people, or you just have it in your heart, like me, to develop people, there may be times you have to develop someone or lead them in ways that they're not even aware of. We're going to learn how to lead or influence like Jesus. True leadership is influence. Everything else, such as rank, title, and official position, is just structural management. Things that are required to make the structure function. Rank, title, and official position. True leadership is found in influence. And I like what one man said. He says, true leadership and development comes whenever you are able to lead a group of people, such as volunteers, who do not have to be there. And we're going to learn a lot of that from Jesus here in this lesson. Now, Jesus was focused on self-development through his connection with his Father. We see this in Mark chapter 1, verse 35, where it says, "And in the morning, rising up a great while before day, he went out and departed into a solitary place and there prayed." That was Mark chapter 1, verse 35. So we see that Jesus was focused on self-development through prayer to the one who could help him the most, and that was God the Father. Jesus was also focused on the development of others. We also see this in Mark chapter 1, verse 17. "And Jesus said unto them, Come ye after me, and I will make you to become fishers of men." Now, I like that phrase, and I underlined it. I will make you to become. Sounds like development to me. And so we're going to learn how to influence. We're going to learn how to develop just like Jesus. So with this in mind, it would do us well to learn the importance of both self-development and developing others like Jesus did. At the end of each of the scenario we're going to read about, at the end of the scenario, I'm going to ask 3 discussion questions. And I want everyone to be ready to answer. I will even give you answers along the way to help start the answer process to these 3 discussion questions. And so this is not a live Q&A session, though if you are interested in potentially doing a live blog broadcast at some point here on the blog, a podcast, leave a comment below and we'll talk about it. We'll think about it and see how we can do that. But in the teaching for tomorrow night, there's going to be a live Q&A. And so, but I want to present these same 3 discussion questions to you, and you can answer them to yourself. You can put them in the comments below, and maybe there'll be a conversation started about these 3 discussion questions. Discussion question number 1 that I'm going to ask after this teaching. Number 1, who did Jesus influence? Number 2, how did he influence them? And number 3, how can we influence people in the same way Jesus did in this situation? So let's go to John chapter 8, and we're going to start with verse number 3, and we're going to talk about Jesus influences others in a sensitive situation. Jesus influences others in a sensitive situation. John chapter 8, verse 3. "And the scribes and Pharisees brought unto him a woman taken in adultery, and when they had set her in the midst, they say unto him, Master, this woman was taken in adultery, in the very act. Now Moses in the law commanded us that such should be stoned. But what sayest thou? This they said, tempting him, that they might have to accuse him." And we're going to stop right there in the first part of verse number 6. And we want to bring out a few different things here and examine how it was that these people tried to influence Jesus. Now, the scribes and Pharisees were the religious leaders in the nation of Israel at that time. Historically, at this point, the nation of Israel was under the authority of the Roman Empire, but the Romans allowed the Jews to keep their culture and their structure intact. So the scribes and Pharisees were the religious leaders of Israel. Now notice here how they tried to influence Jesus. Number 1, they used his title, Master, probably thinking this would appeal to his ego and cause him to drop his guard. Because let's face it, when someone calls us by our official title, doesn't that make you feel important? Doesn't that make you feel good in your natural thinking? Of course it does. Because, maybe we earned it. Maybe we had to work for it, whatever the case. So they used the term master, which the leaders of Israel loved being called master. So they thought, hey, if we love it so much, Jesus will too. So first of all, they tried to influence Jesus by calling him by his title, Master. Number 2, they gave what most people would probably define as an open and shut case. What did they say? This woman was taken in adultery in the very act. Now that the act of adultery under the law of Moses was punishable by immediate death. So they gave what was considered or would have been considered by most people an open and shut case. So they tried to influence Jesus like that. Number 3, the third way they tried to influence Jesus, they set up what seemed like an easy question. What was the question they asked? What sayest thou? Pretty easy, right? Open and shut case. What do you say, Jesus? Here's what the law says. What do you say? So with that in mind, let's keep going. The second part of verse number 6. But Jesus stooped down and with his finger wrote on the ground as though he heard them not. So when they continued asking him, he lifted up himself and said unto them, He that is without sin among you, let him first cast a stone at her. And again he stooped down and wrote on the ground. Now notice the influential approach that Jesus takes here. First, he ignores those who were considered to be the highest authorities in the nation of Israel. They were not used to being ignored, but he ignored them. He is influencing them in a way of which they are not even aware. It's a way they're not used to being influenced, namely, not being able to oppress someone simply by the use of their rank and position. You have to realize most people in the nation of Israel would have trembled at the authority that these people had, these scribes and Pharisees, because the scribes and Pharisees could have condemned them to prison. And so they were not used to someone just blatantly ignoring them. But Jesus was influencing them in a way they were not even aware of yet. Rudyard Kipling said this. He said, beware of over-concern for money or position or glory. Someday you'll meet a man who cares for none of these things. Then you will know how poor you are. Now, this poverty of which Mr. Kipling writes could be financially poor, or it could mean how poor you are in influencing people when you thought you were rich in this area. So these scribes and Pharisees probably thought they were rich with influence only because they had the oppression, or rather they had the ability to use oppression as leverage against people, but they probably thought that they were great influencers when really it was just the power they possessed to harm people that made people submit to them. They were not used to someone not caring about their power, their title, their rank, and position. But Jesus ignored them. So he was influencing them, wasn't he? Look at verse number 9. And they which heard it, being convicted by their own conscience, went out one by one, beginning at the eldest even unto the last. And Jesus was left alone, and the woman standing in the midst. Notice how Jesus influences these people. He says certain words in certain ways, and I'll add this, at a certain time, to get them to come to a realization on their own and then take action on that realization. So let me say it again. Look at how he influences them. He says certain words in certain ways at certain times to get them to come to a realization on their own and then take action on that realization. Most people will not care for most counsel that you give them, whether they ask for it or not, no matter what they tell you. Most people will not care for most counsel that you give them. But if you can influence them to come to a conclusion on their own, they will most likely take that counsel because they will feel they came up with it themselves. That's exactly the approach Jesus took. He did not go head to head with them. He influenced them. He got their attention by ignoring them. And then he asked them a question. Or rather, he made a statement. He said, if you're without sin, cast the first stone. And they came to their own conclusion that I cannot cast a stone because I am not without sin. And of course, they took their own counsel and went away. So look at verse number 8. When Jesus had lifted up himself and saw none but the woman, he said unto her, Woman, where are those thine accusers? Hath no man condemned thee? She said, No man, Lord. And Jesus said unto her, Neither do I condemn thee. Go and sin no more. Now notice how Jesus turns and influences this woman. He did not give her the information directly. He asked her a question. In other words, he didn't say, looks like nobody condemns you. He didn't say that. He asked her a question. He said, Hath no man condemned thee? Now this warranted a response from her, and she said, What? No man, Lord. By asking her the question and letting her answer it for herself, this did two things. Number one, He allowed her to declare her own freedom from condemnation. He could have easily just said, well, there's no penalty for you. No, he set it up in such a way to influence her to declare her own freedom from condemnation. Number two, he influenced her and she became a witness to herself that she had been made free from the penalty she deserved. How did he say that? He said, neither do I condemn thee, go and sin no more. And by doing this, not only, whenever she said, no man, Lord, not only was she a witness to herself that she was made free from the penalty she deserved, but he then gave her a sense of accountability. Neither do I condemn thee, go and sin no more. In other words, he didn't just, quote, let her get away with it this time. He let her go with a sense of accountability. You know what that's called? Influence. What does this approach of influence do? It lays the responsibility to do better squarely in the hands of the decision maker themselves, as it should be. One of the best things that we can learn from Jesus and learn how to influence more like Jesus and be more influential is that if we can influence people to come to a place where they realize things for themselves, that is going to greatly increase the likelihood that they will make better decisions and more positive changes, rather than us just telling them what to change. It's as if Jesus said, you've been given leniency, learn from it and become better because of it. You've been given leniency, learn from it and become better because of it. Now, what better ways to influence others than to take the approach that Jesus takes in this situation? So here are our 3 discussion questions. We'll be discussing these live with a Q&A in the class that I get the privilege of teaching our Army leaders tomorrow. But for those of you here on the podcast with us, here on our blogs, the 3 discussion questions, you can answer them for yourself. You can leave your answers in the comments. That's great. Question number 1, who did Jesus influence? Remember, he influenced a lot of people, right? Who did he influence? Number 2, how did he influence them? We talked about that, right? We talked about a lot of different ways he influenced them. Number 3, how can we influence people in the same way Jesus did in this situation? How can I go out into our respective areas of responsibility and influence and influence those who are higher authority, the same level of authority, or lesser levels of authority than us? How can we go out and influence them and help lead them to a higher level? Something to think about. Take that with you. We're so glad that you joined us in the lesson today. We really do hope that you'll follow and subscribe to our blogs, and so that you may receive the podcast and the blog articles in your email. And we look forward to seeing you in the next lesson. Have a great day. God bless you.